"Daddy, why did that man laugh at our car?" The question came softly. Too softly for a room full of polished shoes and million-dollar automobiles. But somehow, it was the only sound Mason Hale could still hear. His daughter stood beside him, beneath the white showroom lights, one small hand clutching her vintage car book against her chest, the other still hanging awkwardly in the air, where she had almost touched the dark green Bentley. Almost. Not touched. Almost. Across the marble floor, a salesman in a charcoal suit gave a short laugh beneath his breath and said something to another employee near the reception desk. The two men smirked the way people smirk when they believe someone cannot possibly belong in the same room as them. Mason looked down at his daughter. Clara was 6 years old. She had her mother's eyes, big, thoughtful, quiet in a way that made adults underestimate how much she noticed, and right now, those eyes were fixed not on the cars, but on him, waiting for an explanation about the world. And Mason realized with a heaviness that settled deep in his chest that this moment mattered far more than the humiliation itself. Because children do not remember every word adults say. They remember how their parents stood when the world tried to make them feel small. And somewhere far behind the glass walls of the showroom, beyond the expensive perfume and polished chrome and quiet music drifting through hidden speakers, an old navy blue Ford sat alone in the parking lot, rust-spotted, paint faded, cracked mirror sealed with clear adhesive, the ugliest car in the entire building. And before this day ended, the most powerful woman in the luxury automotive world would stand in front of that car and ask a question that would silence everyone in the showroom forever. Who built this? But that came later. For now, Clara lowered her hand slowly from the Bentley's door. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The salesman heard it, and somehow that made it worse. "No harm done," he replied, though his tone carried the exact opposite meaning. "These vehicles are just very expensive. Expensive." The word lingered in the air like perfume that had turned sour. Mason gave a small nod. "I understand," and he did understand. He understood the tone, the judgment, the quick glance at his worn boots, the oil stains that never fully disappeared from the lines of his hands, no matter how long he scrubbed them. He understood all of it, because life had been teaching him versions of the same lesson for years now. People saw what was visible, never what was valuable. Clara stepped closer to him. Mason knelt beside her carefully. "It's okay to admire beautiful things," he said quietly. Her small forehead tightened. "But I'd do anything but bad." "No," Mason said gently. "You didn't." Then he smiled. And it was not the smile of a defeated man. It was the smile of someone who had already survived worse things than embarrassment. "Come on," he said. "Let's keep looking." Clara nodded. But as they walked deeper into the showroom, she just held his hand tighter than before. 3 hours earlier, the morning had begun the way most mornings did in the Hale house. Quiet. Their little rented home sat at the edge of a sleepy Virginia neighborhood, where the porches sagged slightly with age, and every driveway told a different story about the people struggling to stay afloat inside. At 6:30 in the morning, Mason was already in the garage. The overhead light hummed softly at above him, while autumn rain tapped against the roof in uneven rhythms. The garage smelled of old steel, machine oil, coffee, and memory. Clara sat cross-legged on a folded blanket near the workbench, flipping through her thick picture book of classic automobiles while humming quietly to herself. "Daddy, what's prettier? A 1959 Cadillac Eldorado or a 1963 Corvette Stingray?" Mason slid out from beneath a customer's pickup truck and looked at her. "That," he said seriously, "is an extremely dangerous question." Clara burst into laughter, real laughter. The kind children give freely before life teaches them caution. Mason wiped his hands with a rag and watched her for a second longer than necessary. Sometimes he still could not believe Elena was gone. 3 years later, the thought still arrived unexpectedly. Not dramatic, Not sharp, just heavy, like walking through a doorway and instinctively expecting someone to still be standing there. Clara had Elena's eyes, Elena's gentleness, Elena's habit of talking to old objects as if they had feelings. And sometimes, in moments like this, the resemblance hit him so hard he had to look away. Clara turned another page excitedly. "Daddy, can we go see the nice cars today?" Mason smiled faintly. He had known that question was coming. Saturday mornings had become their ritual after Elena passed away. They would drive to luxury dealerships they could never afford and spend hours simply looking, not wanting, not envying, just appreciating, because Clara loved cars the way some children loved fairy tales, and Mason believed beautiful things should never belong only to rich people, even if only for an afternoon. He glanced toward the old Ford Galaxy parked inside the garage. The faded navy paint looked almost gray beneath the morning light. Most people saw a dying car, but Mason saw 4 years of midnight work, thousands of invisible decisions, hand-shaped steel, hours spent rebuilding things nobody else would ever notice. He saw Elena sitting quietly in the folding chair near the wall during her final winter, wrapped in a blanket, watching him work while snow fell outside the garage door. "You know what I love most about you?" she had once asked softly. Mason looked up from the engine block. "What? You fix things carefully, even when nobody's watching." At the time, he had laughed. Now the memory hurt too much to laugh at anymore. Clara climbed off the blanket and walked toward the Galaxy. She placed one tiny palm against the old passenger door, not casually, lovingly, like greeting an old horse. "You ready?" Mason asked. She nodded proudly. "Always." 25 minutes later, the old Galaxy rolled into the parking lot of Hargrove Prestige Motors. And before the engine even stopped running, someone inside the showroom started laughing. The laughter should have ended there. Most humiliations do. A stranger says something careless. A child looks down at the floor. People move on with their day. But something about the little girl holding her father's hand lingered in the showroom long after Mason and Clara disappeared, deeper among the polished rows of luxury cars. Perhaps it was the way Clara kept glancing back toward the entrance, or perhaps it was the way Mason never once reacted with anger. No defensiveness, no wounded pride, only calm. And there is something deeply unsettling about calm dignity in a world that expects humiliation to perform itself loudly. Cameron felt that irritation now, without fully understanding why. He stood near the reception counter, sipping expensive coffee from a paper cup that carried the dealership's gold-embossed logo. Outside the glass wall, the old Ford Galaxy sat crooked beneath the pale autumn sky like a stain on the carefully curated image of the dealership. Cameron took out his phone, snapped a photograph, typed a caption into the employee group chat. Somebody's grandpa escaped the junkyard again. A few laughing emojis appeared almost instantly. The quick digital approval made him feel briefly restored, seen, validated. But when he looked up again, his eyes drifted toward the little girl. Clara stood in front of a silver Aston Martin DB12, with complete stillness, studying it the way children study aquariums in museums. Not greedily, curiously. She slowly opened her book and flipped through pages until she found the matching photograph. Then, very softly, almost reverently, she began reading aloud. Twin-turbo V8, handcrafted interior, top speed, 202 miles per hour. Her finger traced the printed image. Mason stood beside her with one hand in his jacket pocket, listening. Not distracted, not impatient. Listening as though what she said mattered. That was the first thing Giselle noticed about him. Giselle worked weekend hands at Hargrove while finishing community college, and she had learned quickly that wealthy people often looked through service workers as though they were part of the architecture. But this man looked at his daughter the way people look at sunsets, fully present. Clara pointed toward the Aston Martin's side panel. "Daddy, The alignment looks strange there. Mason's eyes shifted, only slightly. A pause, barely noticeable. Then he smiled faintly. Good catch. Giselle blinked. What? Clara pointed again, shy now that someone else was listening. The line near the door. Mason crouched beside her. You see where the reflection bends unevenly? She nodded proudly. That means the panel's sitting slightly proud near the rear edge. Giselle stared. Most adults who entered this showroom could barely identify their own engine type. And yet this 6-year-old girl was spotting body inconsistencies on an Aston Martin. Cameron overheard enough of the conversation to roll his eyes. Or maybe, he interrupted while walking past them, it's just a reflection. His tone carried the thin smile of someone correcting children. Clara immediately looked down. Mason gently rested a hand against her shoulder. It's all right, he said quietly. Then he looked once more at the vehicle. Not emotionally, professionally. And there it was again. That strange stillness. The gaze of someone reading invisible language. He noticed the uneven door-shut line, the minute variation in contour near the quarter panel, the subtle inconsistency in reflected light, tiny flaws, almost impossible to detect, but, once seen, impossible to unsee. Mason had spent half his life training his eyes not to miss things, especially broken things, especially beautiful things, pretending not to be broken. And perhaps that was why grief had nearly destroyed him after Elena died. Because grief was exactly that, a beautiful life continuing outwardly, while something underneath no longer aligned correctly. Daddy? Clara tugged his sleeve softly. He looked down. Can we see the Bentley now? Of course. They moved together across the marble floor. Meanwhile, Cameron returned to the reception area where Xavier, the showroom manager, was reviewing paperwork for an important afternoon client. Aren't you supposed to be helping customers? Xavier asked without looking up. I am helping customers. Xavier finally glanced toward the floor. His eyes landed briefly on Mason and Clara, then outside toward the old galaxy. Don't start, he muttered. Cameron shrugged. I'm just saying, people come here to buy dreams. That thing out there looks like it survived a war. Xavier said nothing, but before he could respond, the entire atmosphere of the showroom shifted. Not dramatically, quietly, like pressure changing before a storm. One by one, employees near the entrance straightened subtly. Voices lowered, movements sharpened, and then the black Range Rover rolled silently into the parking lot. Cameron frowned. No way, Xavier was already moving, fast, because everyone in the luxury automotive world recognized that vehicle. The rear passenger door opened, and Violet Ashford stepped out into the gray morning light. Even from a distance, she carried a presence that could not be mistaken for ordinary wealth. Not flashy, not loud, worse, certain. She wore a charcoal gray coat over a white blouse, dark trousers, and carried absolutely nothing except a slim leather notebook beneath one arm. No jewelry except a watch. Old, elegant, inherited. The kind of watch people stop noticing only after they realize it costs more than their car. Cameron straightened his jacket immediately. Inside the showroom, Xavier practically appeared at the entrance before the driver's door fully closed. Miss Ashford, he said warmly, thank you for visiting Hargrove Prestige. Violet shook his hand politely. No wasted movement, no performative smile. I only have 20 minutes, she said calmly. I'm here for the DB12 configuration. Of course, she stepped inside. And in that exact moment, Clara looked up from her book. The little girl and the billionaire lector locked eyes for half a second across the showroom floor, and something inside Violet Ashford stopped moving. Because 35 years earlier, she had been that child too. Violet Ashford had spent most of her life around powerful men, collectors, executives, investors, men who mistook ownership for understanding. They bought rare cars the way kings once bought paintings, believing possession and appreciation were the same thing. Usually, They were not. But the little girl standing near the Bentley did not look at cars like someone trying to own them. She looked at them the way believers look at stained glass windows, with wonder, and that, more than anything, made Violet stop walking. Clara noticed the elegant woman staring at her and immediately straightened self-consciously. The old cigar book tightened against her chest. Mason turned slightly. His protective instinct was subtle but automatic. Violet noticed that too. Interesting, she thought. Not fearful, not intimidated, protective. "Hello," Violet said softly to Clara. Clara glanced up at her father before answering. "Hi." Violet nodded toward the book. "What are you reading?" Clara opened it carefully to a marked page. Classic European Grand Touring Cars. The seriousness in her voice almost made Violet smile. "Of course it is." Clara pointed toward the Bentley wheel arch nearby. "I like this one better, though." "Why?" The little girl considered the question carefully. "Because it looks patient." Violet blinked once, not at the word itself, at the precision of it. Most adults described cars with horsepower figures or price tags. Beautiful, fast, expensive. But patient? That was the language of someone who observed the soul of things. And suddenly, Violet understood exactly why the old Ford outside had unsettled her the moment she saw it. Because craftsmanship leaves fingerprints invisible to most people. Not literal fingerprints. Rhythms, intentions. Tiny decisions repeated thousands of times until they become personality. The same way handwriting becomes recognizable. And the galaxy outside carried the unmistakable handwriting of a master. Violet slowly lifted her gaze toward Mason. For the first time, she studied him properly. Work boots, oil-stained knuckles, worn denim jacket, tired eyes, not defeated eyes, just tired. The kind of exhaustion grief leaves behind long after funerals end and casseroles stop arriving from neighbors. She had seen it before, mostly in widowers. People surviving life one practical task at a time. "You restored the galaxy outside?" she asked calmly. Mason's expression changed almost imperceptibly, not surprise, recognition, like a chess player realizing another person has finally seen the board correctly. "Yes. Alone?" A faint pause. "My daughter helped." Clara smiled proudly. Violet looked back through the glass showroom wall toward the old Ford sitting beneath the cloudy morning sky. Most people saw rust. She saw impossible panel consistency beneath aged paint. Hand-formed metalwork. No modern shortcuts. No filler-heavy smoothing. No lazy restoration tricks designed only for auctions and photographs. The car carried something extraordinarily rare. Integrity. Not perfection. Integrity. There was a difference. Violet stepped closer to the window. "May I ask you something?" "Sure." "When you rebuilt the driver's side quarter panel, Cameron, standing near reception, barely listened at first. Then Violet continued, did you use an English wheel finish over hand-hammered shaping?" The showroom became very quiet, because nobody there understood what she had just asked, except Mason. And Mason suddenly looked at Violet Ashford differently, too. "Yes," he answered slowly. Now it was Violet's turn to fall silent. Because there were perhaps 20 people left alive who could identify that process by sight alone, and only a handful capable of doing it correctly. Behind the reception desk, Xavier's expression subtly changed. He knew Violet Ashford's reputation. Everyone did. For 30 years, she had been one of the most respected figures in automotive preservation across the United States and United Kingdom. Museums consulted her. Private collections competed for her attention. Auction houses changed estimates if she endorsed a restoration. And right now, she was looking at the quiet single father beside the Bentley with the kind of attention powerful people reserved for discoveries. Violet walked toward the showroom entrance without another word. The staff exchanged confused glances before quickly following behind her. Outside, the autumn wind moved softly across the parking lot. The Galaxy sat alone between two luxury SUVs like a forgotten memory. Violet stopped 3 feet from the hood. Then she crouched slightly. Her eyes moved across the surface, not casually, scientifically. The hood seam, the quarter panel, the rocker line, the subtle tension of hand-shaped steel beneath weathered paint. And then she saw it. Not the craftsmanship, the restraint. That was the extraordinary part. Whoever restored this car had intentionally preserved its scars. The small dent near the bumper, the cracked mirror, the worn chrome edges, the faded paint. Most restorers erased age. This man had honored it, which meant he understood something most craftsmen never learned. A thing does not become beautiful because it escapes time. It becomes beautiful because time leaves evidence behind. Behind her, Clara walked outside holding Mason's hand. The little girl immediately smiled at the Galaxy the way children smile at pets waiting faithfully at the door. She placed her palm softly against the passenger side. Tap, tap. A tiny ritual. Violet watched closely. "You always do that?" she asked gently. Clara nodded. She likes being greeted. A few employees exchanged amused looks, but Violet did not smile. Because somewhere deep inside herself, unexpectedly, painfully, she understood exactly what the little girl meant. Mason rested one hand lightly on the roof. "She thinks cars remember people." "And do they?" Violet asked. Mason looked at the faded paint beneath his fingertips, then toward his daughter, then somewhere much farther away than the parking lot. "I think," he said quietly, "some things carry love longer than people realize." The sentence settled into the cold morning air with astonishing weight, and for the first time since arriving at Hargrove Prestige Motors that day, Violet Ashford stopped seeing a poor mechanic with an old car. She started seeing a man hiding from a life he had once been extraordinary at surviving. And inside the showroom behind them, Cameron suddenly felt the first small crack of discomfort beginning to spread beneath his confidence. The parking lot had gone strangely silent. Not empty, not still, silent. The kind of silence that forms when people realize a conversation is happening on a level they no longer understand. Employees stood near the showroom windows, pretending not to stare. Customers slowed their steps without meaning to. Even Cameron, who had spent the last 20 minutes dismissing Mason Hale as another working-class father wandering through a luxury dealership he could not afford, now found himself watching the old Galaxy with growing uncertainty. Because Violet Ashford was no longer casually inspecting the car, she was studying it, and there was a difference, a profound one. Violet slowly circled the Galaxy, her fingertips resting lightly against the cold autumn air rather than touching the vehicle itself. Respectful, almost ceremonial. Mason noticed. Most people touched old cars carelessly. They slapped fenders, leaned against paint, grabbed door frames with rings on their fingers. But people who truly understood craftsmanship approached differently. Like historians handling fragile documents, like priests approaching altars. Clara stood beside her father, watching quietly. "You really like her," the little girl said. Violet glanced toward her. "Yes." Clara smiled proudly. "She likes you too." Somewhere behind the showroom glass, one employee laughed softly under his breath. But Violet did not, because the child's sentence had unexpectedly pierced something old inside her. When Violet was 9 years old, her grandfather had once taken her to a restoration garage in Connecticut. She still remembered the smell: warm steel, dust, oil, time itself somehow trapped in the walls. An old craftsman had rested one weathered hand against the hood of a 1938 Bugatti and told her something she never forgot. If you listen long enough, every machine tells you the kind of hands that built it. Most people heard sentiment in that sentence, but Violet eventually learned it was technical truth. Craftsmanship always revealed character. Sloppy people left sloppy seams. Arrogant people over-restored. Impatient people rushed invisible details. But this galaxy, this car carried patience, grief, devotion, and astonishing restraint. Violet finally turned back toward Mason. How long did it take? 4 years, working full-time. I repaired local vehicles during the day. And this at night? Mason nodded once. Clara immediately added. And Saturdays, Mason smiled faintly. Yes, Saturdays too. Violet looked back at the car again. 4 years. She mentally recalculated every visible detail against that timeline and felt something close to disbelief. Not because the work was impossible, because it was personal. Most high-level restorations were funded by collectors, museums, or investors. They were projects driven by prestige. This one had clearly been built for love, and that made it rarer than almost any vehicle she had ever encountered. The wind shifted softly across the lot. A strand of Clara's hair blew across her face. Without interrupting the conversation, Mason gently brushed it back behind her ear. The movement was automatic, tender, practiced. Again, Violet noticed. Again, something inside her tightened unexpectedly. There had once been a man who loved her mother that way, quietly, without performance, without witnesses. People underestimated softness because they confused it with weakness. But in Violet's experience, the gentlest people often survived the hardest lives. She looked once more at the galaxy's driver's side panel, then suddenly asked, "Who taught you metal shaping?" Mason hesitated for the first time, only briefly. An old coach builder outside London. That answer landed like a stone dropped into deep water. Because there were almost no American restorers left who trained traditionally in England anymore. The old methods were disappearing, too slow, too expensive, too demanding. Modern shops preferred speed, machines, replacement panels, convenient perfection. But true restoration, the almost lost art of rebuilding a car exactly as it once existed, required something modern industries no longer valued. Patience bordering on obsession. Violet studied him carefully now, the tired eyes, the restrained posture, the way he unconsciously stood half a step closer to Clara whenever strangers approached. And beneath all of it, something familiar. Then her gaze drifted downward, toward his hands, and she froze, very slightly, the scar near the base of his thumb, thin, white, curved diagonally. An English wheel injury. Old-school metal shapers called it the crescent mark. Almost nobody outside elite restoration circles had one anymore. Violet looked up slowly. For the first time all morning, her expression truly changed. Not dramatic, not shocked, certain. "What's your name?" she asked quietly. "Mason." "No," she said softly. "Your full name." Behind the glass walls, Cameron felt his stomach tighten without understanding why. Mason glanced briefly at Clara, then back at Violet. Mason Hale. The world seemed to pause for one suspended second. Even the wind felt quieter. And then Violet Ashford exhaled almost imperceptibly. Of course it was him. Not because fame had made him recognizable. Mason Hale had never cared much for publicity. But in certain circles, in workshops hidden behind museums, private collections, and impossible restorations, his name had become something close to myth. The man who rebuilt impossible things. The ghost craftsman from London. The restorer who walked away at the height of his career without explanation. Violet remembered the Ferrari immediately. Everyone did. A burned 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO that experts across Italy, United Kingdom, and Switzerland had declared unsalvageable. Insurance write-off. Museum loss. Finished. Until Mason Hale rebuilt it almost entirely by hand. The automotive world had called it miraculous, but Violet remembered something else instead. The photographs from the workshop. A younger Mason standing beside unfinished steel panels late at night. No spotlight, no performance, just concentration, like a man trying to repair something larger than a car. And suddenly she understood why he had disappeared. Not scandal, not failure, loss. The answer sat quietly beside him now in the form of a little girl clutching a vintage car book against her chest. Clara looked up curiously. "Daddy," Mason never took his eyes off Violet. "It's all right." But Cameron, standing just inside the showroom entrance, suddenly remembered something too. An article. Years ago, a famous restoration, a photograph. His pulse dropped. Slowly, almost nervously, he pulled out his phone. And somewhere deep inside him, the first real feeling of shame began to arrive. Cameron read the article 3 times before the words fully settled into meaning. The Ghost Restorer. Robbed report. Geneva auction. $11.4 million. The photograph on his phone showed a younger Mason Hale standing beside a deep red Ferrari beneath workshop lights somewhere in London. Same shoulders, same quiet expression, same hands. Only the eyes were different. The man in the photograph looked alive in a way the man standing outside now no longer did. Cameron lowered the phone slowly, and all at once the morning replayed itself in brutal clarity. The joke, the picture he sent to the group chat, the little girl pulling her hand away from the Maserati. People who are not buying should not be touching. Until that moment, Cameron had never truly understood that humiliation could echo backward, that a careless sentence could suddenly expose not the person it targeted, but the person who said it. Inside the showroom, Xavier stepped beside him quietly. "You all right?" Cameron stared through the glass toward Mason and Clara. "No," he admitted softly, and for once it was the truth. Outside, Violet Ashford remained still beside the galaxy. Mason could feel the shift now. The moment recognition changes a conversation permanently. He had experienced it before. At auctions, museums, private collections. People discovering who he used to be. It always created the same uncomfortable transition, from dismissal to fascination, and Mason had grown tired of both. Clara leaned gently against his side. She sensed tension without understanding its shape yet. Children always did. Violet spoke carefully now, not cautiously, respectfully. "I wondered where you went." Mason gave a faint smile without humor. "Mostly Virginia. That's along from the restoration world." That was the point. The answer carried no bitterness, only exhaustion. Violet studied him for a long moment. She had met brilliant men before, many of them. But genius often arrived wrapped in ego. Mason Hale was different. His skill had never become identity, which was perhaps why loss had nearly erased him when it came. "Why did you leave?" she asked quietly. The parking lot fell silent again. Not awkward silence. Human silence. The kind people instinctively make around grief. Mason's gaze drifted toward Clara. The little girl was tracing tiny circles absent-mindedly against the old paint near the passenger door. Tap, 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 the familiar ritual. And suddenly, for just a fraction of a second, Mason saw Elena there instead. Not physically. Memory rarely arrived that cleanly. It came through gestures, echoes, small inherited tendernesses. He remembered Elena sitting in the folding chair inside the garage during chemotherapy treatments, wrapped in 2 blankets despite the summer heat. Watching him shape metal panels late at night. Watching him work the English wheel slowly beneath yellow overhead light while rain moved softly against the garage roof. "You disappear when you work," she had once whispered. Mason glanced over. "Is that bad?" "No," she said gently. "It's beautiful." Back then, he still believed skill could fix things. Then cancer taught him otherwise. Mason swallowed carefully. "My wife got sick." Violet's expression softened almost invisibly. Clara lowered her eyes. She had heard this story before. Children listened differently each time. "She died 3 years ago," Mason continued quietly. "After that, my daughter needed stability more than the world needed restored Ferraris." No one spoke for several seconds. Even Cameron, still standing near the showroom entrance, felt something heavy settle in his chest. Because suddenly, the old galaxy no longer looked neglected. It looked protected. Every dent preserved, every scar intentional. Not because the owner could not afford perfection, because perfection was never the point. Violet looked again at the faded paint. You kept the original exterior. Yes, most restorers wouldn't. Mason nodded once. Clara said it looked like a storybook car. The little girl smiled shyly. It does. Mason rested his hand lightly against the roof. She loved it exactly the way it was. Loved present tense. Not loved. Violet noticed that too. Grief had strange grammar. People never truly stopped speaking about the dead in present tense, once love settled deeply enough. Because love did not disappear. Only the person carrying it visibly through the world did. A cold breeze crossed the lot. Clara shivered slightly. Without interrupting the conversation, Mason removed his jacket and draped it gently over her shoulders. The movement was so instinctive it almost hurt to witness. Violet suddenly understood something difficult. Mason Hale had not abandoned greatness. He had sacrificed visibility for fatherhood, and those were not the same thing. Inside the showroom, Giselle quietly approached Cameron. You should probably delete the group chat messages. Cameron closed his phone immediately. Too late. Not because anyone important had seen them. Because he had. And now he could not stop seeing himself inside them. Across the parking lot, Clara looked up at Violet curiously. Are you rich? Mason closed his eyes briefly. Clara, but Violet surprised him. Yes, she answered honestly. Clara thought about this seriously, then pointed toward the galaxy. My daddy's rich too. Silence. Not mocking silence. The dangerous kind. The kind that arrives when a child accidentally tells the truth. Adults spend entire lives misunderstanding. Cameron felt heat rise into his face. Even Xavier looked away. But Violet smiled for the very first time that morning. A real smile. Small, unpracticed. Because the little girl was right. Money could purchase rarity, status, access. But the thing resting quietly beneath Mason Hale's weathered hands in that hot parking lot, the patience, devotion, restraint, and invisible labor required to build something beautiful over 4 years while surviving grief alone. That kind of wealth had become extraordinarily rare in the modern world. And suddenly Violet understood with complete certainty. She had not come to Hargrove Prestige Motors looking for a car that morning. She had come looking for Mason Hale. Neither of them had known it yet. The afternoon light had begun to change. The hard silver brightness of morning softened into something warmer now, stretching long reflections across the dealership windows and turning the faded navy paint of the galaxy almost beautiful from certain angles. Not restored beautiful. Lived-in beautiful, the kind that only time can create. Inside the showroom, business slowly resumed around them, but awkwardly, as though everyone sensed they had witnessed something larger than a luxury car inspection and did not yet know how to return to ordinary conversation afterward. Xavier attempted professionalism. Salesman resumed smiling. Coffee cups moved again. But the atmosphere had shifted permanently. Because once people discover they misjudged someone deeply, every interaction afterward feels slightly unstable. Violet Ashford stood quietly beside Mason near the galaxy. Clara sat cross-legged on the curb nearby, flipping through her car book while absent-mindedly swinging her small boots back and forth. For several moments, no one spoke. Then Violet finally said, I've spent 2 years searching for you. Mason looked at her carefully. That seems unlikely. It does, she admitted. But it's true. The autumn wind moved softly through the parking lot. A few leaves scraped quietly across the pavement. Violet rested one hand inside the pocket of her coat. There's a restoration initiative beginning next spring. Museums, private collections, historical archives across 3 continents. Mason already disliked where the conversation was going. He could feel it, not because he lacked interest, because a certain part of him had spent years trying very hard not to want things anymore, wanting reopened rooms inside people. and some rooms hurt once entered again. Violet continued calmly. 27 historically significant vehicles, several considered impossible to fully restore. Mason gave a faint smile. People say impossible too easily. For the first time, Violet almost laughed. "Yes," she said softly. "That's exactly what I was told about you." Clara looked up immediately. "Daddy fixes impossible things." The sentence landed with astonishing innocence and devastating precision. Mason glanced down at her. Something fragile moved behind his tired eyes. Because children often describe people more accurately than adults do. Not smarter, cleaner. Clara had watched her father rebuild broken things her entire life. Engines, panels, rust, silence. Himself. Violet slowly removed a small cream-colored card from her coat pocket. Heavy paper stock, simple lettering, no decorative excess. Old money never needed decoration. She handed it to Mason. "I want you to lead the Heritage Restoration Project." The words settled quietly between them. Inside the showroom, Cameron froze mid-step near the reception desk. Even Xavier looked stunned, because this was not a consulting offer, not freelance work, not publicity. This was one of the most prestigious restoration appointments in the world. Mason did not take the card immediately. Instead, his eyes drifted toward Clara, sitting beside the curb. Toward the little girl tracing circles against the edge of her book while humming softly to herself. Always humming. Elena used to hum exactly the same way when reading. The memory arrived so suddenly it nearly stole his breath. For one terrible second, he saw her again, sitting in the folding chair inside the garage beneath winter light, thin from treatment, too pale. Watching him shape steel beneath the overhead lamp. "You miss being challenged," she had whispered once. Mason kept sanding quietly. "No, you're lying." He smiled despite himself. "You always know?" "Yes." She reached for his hand back then. Warm fingers despite the illness. "You were never meant to disappear, Mason." The memory faded slowly, painfully. Back in the parking lot, Violet was still speaking. "You would choose your own workspace, your own team, your own schedule." Mason remained silent. "Travel restrictions if needed," she added gently. "Limited appearances. Complete authority over restoration standards." Still silence. Violet studied him carefully now. Most people would have answered immediately, some out of greed, others from ambition. But Mason Hale was standing there fighting something much more difficult than temptation, fear. Not fear of failure. Fear of returning to the part of himself grief had buried. He finally looked at her. "I have a daughter. I know." She already lost one parent. The sentence changed everything, because suddenly this was no longer about career, or recognition, or craftsmanship. It was about survival. Violet glanced toward Clara. The little girl was now kneeling beside the Galaxy, carefully wiping dust from the chrome trim with the sleeve of Mason's oversized jacket. The sight hit Violet unexpectedly hard. Not because it was adorable, because it was love in its purest form. Attention. People think love is dramatic. Usually it is simply sustained care over time. "She needs stability," Mason said quietly. Violet nodded once, then answered with surprising softness. "A child also needs to see who their parent truly is." Mason looked at her sharply, not offended, wounded, because the sentence struck too close to something he had been quietly avoiding for years. Clara looked up suddenly. "Daddy, yeah, if you fix museum cars." She hesitated carefully. Would they still come home? The question nearly broke him. Mason crouched beside her slowly. "Why would you ask that?" "Because happy things keep leaving." Silence. Absolute silence. Even the traffic noise beyond the street suddenly felt far away. Mason's face changed then. Not visibly to strangers, but enough. Enough for Violet to see the raw grief still living underneath the calm exterior. Children did not always understand death fully, but they understood absence with terrifying accuracy. Mason gently brushed Clara's hair behind her ear. "I would always come home. promise." His throat tightened. "Yes," he whispered. "I promise." Clara studied his face seriously for a moment longer, then nodded once, accepting the answer with the solemn trust children reserve for parents they love completely. She slipped her tiny hand into his, and just like that, the decision was no longer about cars, or prestige, or the world finally rediscovering Mason Hale. It became about whether a grieving father was ready to start living again, instead of merely surviving. The late afternoon sunlight slid softly across the faded hood of the Galaxy, and beneath the rust, beneath the worn paint and cracked mirror and years of invisible labor, the old car seemed almost to glow quietly in the autumn light, like something patiently waiting to begin again. 3 years later, the Galaxy returned to Hargrove Prestige Motors, not restored, not repainted, not transformed into something shinier for strangers to admire. It arrived exactly as it always had. Faded navy paint, cracked side mirror, small dent near the rear bumper, rust freckles beneath autumn light. Only now, people moved aside when it entered the parking lot, not because of the car itself, because of the man driving it, and because somewhere along the way, the world had finally learned the difference between appearance and value. The annual Ashford Heritage Exhibition had become one of the most respected automotive preservation programs in the world. Museums across United States, Japan, France, and United Kingdom now displayed vehicles restored under Mason Hale's direction. But strangely, the more famous he became, the quieter his life remained. He still lived in Virginia, still drank coffee in the garage before sunrise, still repaired neighbors' pickup trucks when they needed help. And every Saturday morning, no matter how busy the world became around him, he still made time for Clara. Because some promises mattered more than success. The Galaxy rolled gently into its old parking spot. Clara, now 9 years old, and somehow already carrying traces of the woman she would one day become, grinned as she climbed out, holding a much newer version of her vintage automobile book, though she hardly needed it anymore. Most days now, she corrected museum guides. Mason stepped out beside her. A cool October wind drifted through the lot carrying the smell of rain and fallen leaves. For a moment, he simply stood there with one hand resting on the roof of the Galaxy. Tap, tap, the same old ritual, the same old greeting. Clara smiled softly when she saw it. "You still do that every time." Mason glanced at her. "So do you," she laughed quietly. Inside the showroom, Cameron watched them through the glass. 3 years had changed him too. Not dramatically. Real change rarely is. But there was a softness to him now that had not existed before. A patience, a carefulness with people, especially people others overlooked. The joke he once made about the Galaxy had followed him longer than he expected. Not publicly. Nobody talked about it anymore. But shame, when it changes you correctly, becomes something useful. A permanent reminder to look twice before deciding who matters. As Mason and Clara entered the showroom, Cameron approached them himself. No performance, no nervousness, just honesty. "Good to see you both again." Clara smiled immediately. "Hi, Cameron." He crouched slightly toward her. "You still know more about cars than the rest of us." "Probably." That made him laugh. A real laugh this time. Mason shook his hand. And in that simple moment lived one of the quiet truths nobody talks about enough. Sometimes redemption is not dramatic. Sometimes it is simply becoming kinder than you used to be. Across the showroom floor, preparations were underway for the exhibition's featured unveiling. Collectors, historians, press photographers, people from all over the world gathered beneath the white lights, waiting to see the restored centerpiece Mason had spent nearly 2 years rebuilding. But Mason barely looked at the stage. His attention remained where it usually did, on Clara. She wandered slowly through the showroom, studying reflections across polished body panels while speaking softly about suspension geometry to a museum curator who looked both confused and deeply impressed. And suddenly Mason heard Elena laughing in his memory so clearly it nearly stopped him where he stood. Not the sound itself, the feeling of it. Warm, alive, close. He looked down instinctively, half expecting her hand to still be there beside his. Grief never fully disappeared. People lied about that. What changed was your relationship to it. In the early years after Elena died, grief had felt like drowning. Now it felt more like carrying a lamp through darkness, heavy sometimes, but beautiful too, because the pain existed only where love once lived greatly. You kept your promise. Violet Ashford's voice arrived gently beside him. Mason looked over. She stood with her hands folded calmly before her. Older now too, somehow, though still carrying that same composed gravity she always had. What promise? To stop disappearing. Mason looked toward Clara. The little girl was kneeling beside the galaxy again outside the glass wall, wiping dust carefully from the chrome trim with the sleeve of her sweater, exactly the way she had years earlier. Only now she was tall enough to reach farther along the panel. He smiled faintly. I'm still learning. Violet followed his gaze. Most worthwhile things take time. The showroom lights dimmed slightly. The presentation was about to begin. Applause gathered softly near the stage. But before Mason moved, Clara suddenly ran back toward him carrying something in both hands. A small, folded piece of paper. I found this in the glove compartment. Mason frowned slightly. What is it? I think it's Mom's handwriting. The world narrowed instantly. Carefully, Mason unfolded the paper. And there it was, Elena's handwriting, soft blue ink, slightly slanted. The note was old and worn from years hidden inside the galaxy's compartment, unnoticed. Mason read silently, then stopped breathing for one terrible second. Clara looked up nervously. What does it say? Mason swallowed hard. For a long moment he could not answer. Then finally, very quietly, he handed the note to her. Clara read aloud softly beneath the golden showroom light. For Clara, if you ever read this one day, it means your father kept going. Please remember something important. The world will always notice loud people first. But almost everything beautiful in this life is built quietly. Your father taught me that. Silence. Absolute silence. Even the crowd near the stage seemed far away suddenly. Clara looked up slowly, her eyes filling before she fully understood why. Mason turned away for one brief second, pressing trembling fingers against his mouth. And Violet, standing nearby, understood at once that this, not the exhibitions, not the restorations, not the recognition, was the true masterpiece of Mason Hale's life. Not the cars he rebuilt, the love he preserved. Outside, evening light settled softly across the old galaxy. And beneath the faded paint, beneath the worn chrome and invisible hand-shaped steel, the car carried exactly what it always had. Proof that the most extraordinary things in this world are rarely the loudest ones. Sometimes they are simply the things someone cared for faithfully, long after everyone else stopped noticing.